Good morning. Today on Spotlight, the fight for racial equality and justice in America, past, present, and future. What does the 2020 Black Lives Movement have in common with the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s? And what are the key differences? I'll ask my guest, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence of Michigan's 14th Congressional District, and Karen Gray Houston, journalist and now author of a brand new book entitled Daughter of the Boycott. It's Sunday, June the 14th. I'm Chuck Stokes, and this is Spotlight. Congresswoman, thank you for joining us from Washington today. Hope you're doing well.
I am. I'm doing well. When people ask me that, I said, health-wise, I'm doing well. My heart is broken, and this is a lot.
Oh,
Being a
absolutely.
Black woman in America and being a member of Congress, I have a unique sense of responsibility to fix what's happening.
You're in what oftentimes is referred to as the sausage-making business of making legislation. What can be done in Washington? What are you trying to do that is lasting and concrete?
So what I have before me is an opportunity to make law, to pass bills that will change the culture of policing in the United States. Someone challenged me the other day and said, "Do you think this fix it?" I want everyone to know this is just the first step. And the Justice and Policing Bill or Act that the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, which I'm on the executive board of, it deals with, and you cannot no longer use as a police officer a chokehold in your apprehension of a alleged victim, not victim, but it should be suspect. You cannot, we cannot in the justice system only use the word willfully when you are accused of a crime while you're performing your job. And so when you go before a judge, they ask you, did you willfully just go and say, I'm going to kill this person? We are adding recklessly um, to that because what that police officer did to Mr. Floyd, it was reckless. We also want to make sure we mandate training. We also are looking at where we are with establishing a national registry. So when we looked at the officer who murdered Mr. Floyd, he had numerous complaints filed against him, and there is no national registry. So when he was fired, he could go to another community with his long years of service, being qualified as a police officer without this being part of the evaluation of whether he should continue to be a police officer.
Do you support defunding police departments across the board in America, or should that be something that is by individual cities and individual legislatures?
I don't support defunding the police departments. What I do support is each city and each local community who has a police force to look at the dollars that are spent in policing and make a serious evaluation of, can these monies, like for mental health, can we use that money for a human trafficking task force? Can we use that money to do some education on diversity training or training for our police department? But to make that serious evaluation, because I know as a mayor, and I was on the executive board of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the majority of almost every city's budget goes to public safety.
All right, Congresswoman, hang on for 1 second. Need to take a little pause for the calls. We'll hurry right back with Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence. Real quick final question. Unfortunately, time is my worst enemy here, and I know you have to get back into the hearings. There is a call to be able to remove statues all across this nation, and some of them even in Washington, in there where you legislate with people who have maybe racist past or questionable past, taking away these landmarks. Do you support that?
I don't think white privilege understand how insulting it is to have a statue of recognition of a person who openly and publicly, in most of these cases, said that they did not see Black lives as being equal to white lives, that they purposely worked to enslave, that they deliberately devalued, attacked, and supported policies that would treat African Americans as subhuman and not as the same rights as white Americans. It's hurtful.
So you would be open to some of them, and depending on which ones and where.
Just like we changed the name of Cobo Hall. Who knew? All these years we said Cobo, Cobo, Cobo. We didn't know that this was a mayor who deliberately tried to keep African Americans out of the city of Detroit. Um, so, I mean, we're not going to be able to wipe them all out. Unfortunately, our history is too intertwined with people who believed and supported slavery, who believed and supported Jim Crow. But some of them are so blatant that it's just a matter of saying we're going to move forward. We're not going to celebrate those who discriminated against us. And I do welcome that.
All right, very well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And when Spotlight returns, I'll have a conversation with Karen Gray Houston. She is a journalist and the author of a brand new book about the bus boycott in Montgomery. We'll be right back. Stay with us. And welcome back to Spotlight. Joining me now is Karen Gray Houston, longtime friend, but also a professional journalist, retired not terribly long ago, but is still writing and is still doing all the things that journalists do. First time on Spotlight, and actually the first time professionally I'm interviewing you, even though we've known each other for years. Karen, welcome to Spotlight.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, and we'll talk about the book and anything else you want to discuss.
All right, well, it sounds good. It's ironic because we grew up in the same northeastern Ohio neighborhoods, both alums of Columbia University Journalism School, even though we were there at different times. So we've got a lot of things in similarity. But let's jump right into the book. You have written a new book called Daughter of the Boycott, Carrying on a Montgomery Family Civil Rights Legacy. And you write at the beginning of that book, you talk about your uncle and your dad, and you say Fred and Thomas Gray left a legacy and trail of political activism. Now I plan to reclaim that legacy and its lessons, as well as reflect on their relevance to the world today, a world that is still learning that Black lives matter. Obviously you had Black Lives Matter in mind, but you couldn't have known about George Floyd and all that has happened in the last few weeks. It's rather ironic that your new book is coming out right now in the similarities between these two different generations of civil rights.
How timely. I mean, very prophetic, and I had no idea that it was going to be quite this timely. And even though I'm writing mostly about the Montgomery bus boycott and the legacy of my family's involvement, the first chapter is on a case of white police brutality. Who knew? I mean, it started with a friend of my father's who they played called it sandlot football together, Hilliard Brooks, when they were kids, and they were both veterans of World War II. And in 1950, 5 years before Rosa Parks refused to relinquish her seat to a white passenger, this was another problem in an encounter on a bus. Hilliard Brooks was trying to get a ride downtown Dexter Avenue, big street in downtown Montgomery. He was drunk and disorderly. There's no dispute about that. But a bus driver ordered him off the bus, called over a police officer. There was some sort of exchange, which is in dispute, but no reason for the police officer to pull out his gun and start shooting. And he killed Hilliard Brooks, and 2 other bystanders were injured. So that's how the book starts.
Well, you do a good job of laying out that case, which most people, I would guess, don't know anything about. And it was a precursor to Rosa Parks and the whole Montgomery bus boycott and all of the things that came. It was even right around that time when you write about extensively in the book, the 4 women who refused to get off the bus in Montgomery before Rosa Parks, and you do a good job of laying that out in that part of history and how, to a great extent, maybe they have been overlooked or certainly didn't get the notoriety that Rosa Parks got. But what was interesting is that I came away from the book was how organized your dad and your uncle and all of the other people involved in that Montgomery bus boycott were in their planning of their marches and their boycotts. And there was always something that they had as a goal in mind, whether it was increasing voter turnout or it was trying to make sure that they had impact on Montgomery economically. Do you see that same sort of thing happening with our marches today?
Well, Fred Gray, my uncle, will tell you that what they did that may be different from what's going on now, or what the answer in the future is community and planning. Now, when I look at Black Lives Matter, and what I see that's a little bit different about the protest of the 50s and the 60s is that there were voices of leadership. There were people like Martin Luther King and Andrew Young and Ralph Abernathy and Jesse Jackson. And there were they were mapping strategy behind the scenes, and there was a lot of planning going on that was coordinated. With Black Lives Matter, they have been priding themselves actually on not in being a loosely woven group where you can't really point to who's in charge. And interestingly, I spoke to a young protester who's been going down to the protest by the across from the White House, and he was saying that he can see what they need is more in the field coordination, so that for example, reporters who are covering the stories know who to go to talk to, rather than just grabbing random folks who are running down the streets.
Several years ago, I think in 2013, I had the pleasure of interviewing your uncle, Fred Gray, in Tuskegee, Alabama. And I was struck by the fact at that time, before all of what we see happening today, while he cited the tremendous progress that had been made, and he is unquestionably the most celebrated civil rights attorney in the United States, won the greatest number of cases, that he said, we are not finished with this fight, more or less, to paraphrase his words, that the fight for equal justice is long from being over, and we better not rest on our laurels. I get that same sort of message coming out of your book as you tell these stories from Montgomery.
The struggle continues. My uncle says it every time he gives a speech, and I've been following him around to his speaking engagements in the course of the 5 years it took me to write the book.
And how old is your uncle now, Karen? Just interrupting.
He'll be 90 in December, and he's still talking about what happened in Montgomery. People are still reaching out to him to speak at dinners and giving him lifetime achievement awards and honorary doctorate degrees and things like that. So he's very active, and I consult with him about issues all the time. But what have we found? George Floyd was, we saw him basically being killed with a police officer's knee on his neck because somebody had a cell phone with a camera. So I don't know how you stop it.
Yeah. All right, we need to take a little break. When we come back, I want to find out from you exactly why you wrote this book and what you hope today's society gets out of this diving back into civil rights history. We'll be right back with Karen Gray Houston. Don't go away. And welcome back to Spotlight. The book is Daughter of the Boycott, written by Karen Gray Houston, and she's one of my guests today on Spotlight. Karen, you're a journalist. You're trained by Fred Friendly and some of the other great journalists that were at Columbia. Why did you write this book, and what do you hope today's society gets out of it? What's the importance of diving back into this history? Because if there's one thing I'm starting to hear a lot from people of all different races, is that in the midst of this Black Lives Matter, they want to understand maybe what African Americans have gone through better, and what better way than to pick up a book.
I wrote this book, Chuck, to thank my father and my uncle and all those foot soldiers and unknown and unheralded heroines and heroes who paused their lives in a fight for racial justice, because that's what they were doing in the 1950s in Montgomery. And I want to thank them for opening doors of opportunity for people like me and you. You know, in 1955, you would not have thought that you would see you anchoring a TV program or hosting a TV program, or me having this incredible career in broadcasting that I had. And so there were people who went before, and I wanted to let some of the millennials and younger people know some of these little known, untold stories so that they will realize that they have opportunities today that they would not have had not the bus boycott kickstarted a civil rights movement.
Well, there's so many ironies in this book, and there's so many things about it that teach this generation about the struggle. You know, I think about your dad, who was a businessman in Montgomery, and he wanted to become a lawyer. The University of Alabama wouldn't allow him because of his color. He eventually became appointed a federal judge in the district that took him back to Alabama.
What an irony that was. We were, I'm going to say, displaced refugees is what I call my family in the book. I mean, we couldn't stay in Alabama for my father to realize his dream. We had to move out of the state, move his whole family to Cleveland. And when he wanted to go back to practice law with Fred Gray, his younger brother in Montgomery, for whatever reasons, he couldn't pass the bar in Alabama, but could pass the bar in Ohio. And so redirected his career because he found that a pattern of segregation. I mean, segregation didn't stop at the borders to go up north. Stubborn pattern of redlining and keeping Black people out of housing. And so he spent a lot of time with civil rights law in northern cities, in Cleveland, Ohio.
Karen, are you optimistic? You talk to Blacks, you talk to whites, you talk to all kinds of historic figures about this. You drill down on the research at the Library of Congress and other places. Looking at what's happening today and knowing the history, are you optimistic on where America is headed?
I am hopeful, Chuck. I am hopeful because this time really it does feel different. It feels as if this could be a turning point, that George Floyd's death is going to be a catalyst for hopefully some more meaningful change. But what is disturbing is that this pattern of racial profiling and institutional racism is stubborn and hard to fight. So, you know, I hate to say what, and this is what we've always said as reporters, we'll just have to wait and see.
Question. Out of all the people you interviewed and you write about in this book, and let's set your dad and your uncle aside for just a second, because we'll talk about that in a minute, who perhaps has stuck with you the most? Who did you learn maybe the greatest lesson from that you just can't get out of your mind?
Oh, what a hard question. Because they were all, I was surprised at every turn. I met a lot of people who had roles in the movement and who were affected by it, including some white allies. Claudette Colvin is an interesting figure. She was a teenage girl, 15 years old, in 1955 in March, 9 months before Rosa Parks gave up her seat. Claudette Colvin did the same thing. And a lot of people don't know her name. She was dragged off of a bus, complaining that it was her constitutional right to sit there. She was in the Black section, and she paid her fare. She should not have had to get up to give her seat to a white person. The problem was just the turn of events. 2 months later, Claudette was pregnant, and Black leaders in Montgomery felt that the face of an unwed teenage mother wasn't what they wanted to have on their test case of segregation. And so Rosa Parks's case was a little bit more compelling, though there were 4 other women who also gave up their seats, refused to give up their seats, before Rosa Parks, and who were involved in the federal lawsuit that eventually went to the Supreme Court and overturned segregation on transportation in Montgomery. They have been lost in the shuffle of history. Most people don't know their names: Aurelia Browder, Susie McDonald, Mary Louise Smith, and Claudette Colvin. And what people also don't know is that Rosa Parks was not a part of that lawsuit.
That's very
Rosa
true.
Parks was arrested for disorderly conduct, not for violating the segregation law.
Final question. There has been some talk throughout the years about your uncle getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He's 90 years old now, or almost 90. He has outlived most of the leading figures of the civil rights movement, especially those that were the most high profile. He was a legal architect of the civil rights movement. Much of what he did was behind the scenes and people didn't know his name. Are you hopeful that he will get that honor and that your book may contribute to that by just having this out there for people to remember his contribution?
He is deserving. He's been, a lot of the cases he has argued are landmark cases that are studied in constitutional law textbooks. And, he argued for federal troop protection of the marchers who who were beaten back the first time they tried to march from Selma to Montgomery across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He was involved in some voting rights cases that went to the Supreme Court, Gamillion versus Lightfoot. There's a whole string of cases, and he represented the victims of the Tuskegee syphilis study and was able to help convince President Clinton to make a public apology for that. And he has co-founded a museum as a permanent memorial to those victims in Tuskegee. And so he's got a long trail, a long legacy that ought to be recognized. And I would love to see him get that medal.
Karen Gray Houston, thank you so much. We could do another half hour. Unfortunately, they don't give me all that much more time, so I got to get out when I got to get out. It's so good seeing you again, and best to you and your family. And once again, the brand new book called Daughter of the Boycott by Karen Gray Houston. Have a great day.
My pleasure.
That's it for today. I'm Chuck Stokes. We'll be back next week with more newsmakers in the spotlight. We hope you have a great week.